This is the Meetinghouse with Dwight A. Moody. News, reviews, commentary, and conversation on religion and American life. Now, here is Dr. Moody.
Hello, everybody, and welcome again to the Meetinghouse. I'm coming to you today, as we have for the last several months, from the beautiful studio in Western North Carolina, Hendersonville, North Carolina, to be exact, but we're broadcasting out of Louisville, Kentucky with the St. Stephen's Baptist Church video ministry, and also out of Brunswick, Georgia on the FM radio network. This is August, and this is the time of year when we take vacations and take a break and give our staff a little time off. And so all of the shows broadcasting now are rebroadcasting the best shows of the year. And so throughout this month, here at the Meetinghouse, we're going to be sharing once again the best interviews. Today with the popular author, former pastor, Brian McLaren. Many of you have read his books. You've heard him speak, as I have. I count him a personal friend since the day he came to Georgetown College at my invitation and spoke at our pastor's conference. And I was delighted to talk with him again earlier this year about his new book. But of course, we're going to begin today with the news from August the 5th, 2021. And as always, I've got 5 news stories and brought to you by PerfectoCoffeeInc.com. Perfecto Coffee Inc. You know the story. I share it almost every week. Former students of mine who have gone out to California and opened their own business, entrepreneurs. I honor them for it. So here's the news of today from Birmingham, Alabama, a sad story. Popular Christian evangelist Wade Morris, age 51, died of COVID in a Birmingham hospital. His death occurred 25 days after preaching at a large youth camp in Oklahoma. That's just about the normal time for COVID to strike a person. The camp housed more than 30,000 people over a 7-week stretch, including the July 5 to 9 week when Morris was the feature preacher to thousands of young people. The camp is owned by the Oklahoma Baptist Convention. They reported that the number of COVID cases among the campers was, quote, statistically small, end quote. Nobody has said whether Reverend Morris had been vaccinated against the virus. From Washington, D.C., the Public Religion Research Institute released findings from its June Religion and Vaccine Survey. They've been doing it now about every 3 months. It updates and expands the same survey conducted in March, 3 months ago. Among the religion groups, Hispanic Catholics have increased most in vaccine acceptance from 56% to 80% in June. That's good. Nearly 8 in 10 white Catholics are also vaccine acceptors, up from 68% in March. Other non-Christians, Christians, and religiously unaffiliated and white mainline Protestants are all above the 70% mark of those who accept and support the vaccines. Hispanic Protestants and white evangelical Protestants remain the least likely religious groups to be vaccine acceptors, only 56% for both of them. But the good news is both groups saw double-digit increases in their acceptance since March, and that's indeed good news. From Beaufort, South Carolina, not far from my home on St. Simon's Island, Carolyn Campbell and her family attend Community Bible Church in Beaufort, South Carolina. Unbeknown to her parents, Caroline began copying upon common lined paper the scripture text used by her pastor for Sunday sermons. That is, she would take a pen and paper and write out by hand the text her pastor was using. That started in January 2012. The practice expanded to include the whole Bible. She started in Genesis and worked her way through Revelations, writing down all 782,815 words from her 1973 New American Standard Bible. It took 10,000 pages organized into 43 binders. Caroline, who is 28 with Down syndrome, serves as a greeter for the church, finished this project in June of 2021. The church held a celebration for her in June when she finished copying the book of Revelation. What a story. What a neat story. In Washington, D.C., a Muslim American has been nominated to be the U.S. Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom. President Biden has selected Rashad Hussain as his nominee for that post, filling a State Department slot vacant since former Kansas Governor and U.S. Senator Sam Brownback left at the close of the Trump administration. Hussain, who needs to be confirmed by the Senate, currently works as Director for Partnerships and Global Engagement at the National Security Council. Biden also appointed 2 new commissioners to the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. Kaiser Khan, the Harvard-educated Muslim immigrant who rose to prominence at the Democratic National Convention last year, and Rabbi Sharon Kleinbaum of Atlanta. Tokyo, the Olympics. They've taken the international stage for the past few weeks. Among the medal winners are those who take the occasion to give a religious testimony. Among these, in the American team, Caleb Dressel, who won 5 gold medals in swimming, Tamara Mensah-Stock, who won gold in wrestling, Kendra Harrison, who won silver in track and field, and there were many others. And then there's Artem Dokhlabat, that's hard to pronounce, gold medal winner, gymnast representing Israel. But his country will not let him marry his fiancée because, according to Jewish Orthodox law, he's not considered Jewish enough. I wonder how this attention on the Olympic stage in Tokyo might impact that decision going forward. That's all the news from the Meetinghouse, 5 stories, brought to you by our coffee company, PerfectoCoffeeInc.com. Go there and order your own coffee. Our guest today in the Meetinghouse is a familiar name to many, many people in the United States. A popular pastor, now an award-winning author, traveling speaker, Brian McLaren. He now lives in South Florida. He's written a series of popular books. I count him a friend since the day he came to Georgetown College at my invitation to speak to our pastors there. I talked with him earlier this year, and you're going to enjoy once again listening to our conversation about his new book. Here is Brian McLaren in the Meetinghouse. My guest today is Brian McLaren. We're talking about his new book, which I have here. I've written a review of it on the meetinghouse.net. You can see that with all the other books that I have reviewed. Brian, welcome to the Meetinghouse. Let's talk about your book. I want to say right up front that your chart in the back of the book, appendix number 1, the 4 stages of faith, is wonderful.
Oh, thanks.
I didn't see it until I read up to that part. You trace your journey through these four stages.
Yes. I grew up in a very conservative Christian group most people have never heard of called the Plymouth Brethren. The only people who probably ever heard of the Plymouth Brethren were are people who've heard of Garrison Keillor, who used to run the Prairie Home Companion, and then Jim Wallace also comes from that background. We were pretty sure we were the only true Christians. We thought maybe a few Baptists might get into heaven with us, but probably not the Presbyterians, that's for sure. But I grew up in a setting where faith was, everything was clear. We had the answers. And it was sort of a wonder that so few of us were right and so many were wrong. But that's the way a lot of people grow up. And we tend to believe what we're told when we're kids. And that was my heritage.
You call it in this book simplicity,
Yes.
The first stage that you were in. And it was my stage. The journey that you lay out here is my journey. I grew up a Southern Baptist. I didn't know who the Plymouth Brethren were until I got into seminary and we had to study them. But of course, we thought only some Baptists had all the truth, not even all the Baptists. Right and wrong. I grew up that way. So many people started out in their Christian journey in this conservative culture that had rules and doctrines and oughtness. Somehow, though, you and I both caught the Spirit of Jesus in that carried us through it. These stages of four stages: simplicity, complexity, perplexity, and harmony. Give us just a sentence or two about each one of them that maybe describes your own journey.
Sure, Dwight. Well, the first thing I always like to say is there are so many different stage theories, and they all are interesting, and they all can be abused, and that's true of this one as well. So as long as people realize this is just one way to try to tell a story and find commonalities, but there are exceptions to everything. But simplicity, you could say, is faith before doubt. It's when we're children and we have no option but to trust what our authority figures tell us. And it's the stage of simplicity, us, them, in, out, good, bad. We see the world in terms of two. And then many of us grow into complexity, where we realize, wow, things weren't quite that simple. And so now you might say we got a contract of simplicity, and now we try to add some fine print and deal with the complexities. You could say complexity is faith managing doubt. So now questions come up and we work hard to fix everything and solve every problem and keep our system intact. Then I think more and more people at a younger and younger age, that stops working. And what they start to say, it doesn't matter how much fine print I put onto the contract, something is still wrong. And this would be stage 3, which I would just call faith in doubt. And I mean that in a couple of different ways. First, your faith that you inherited is in doubt. But in a certain sense, you have faith in doubt. You're trusting that doubt will help you maybe see the truth. And I think a lot of people, when they reach that third stage, they feel they have to leave their church or religious background because there are relatively few churches that make room for people in stage 3. Thankfully, there are a few, but not too many. And I think a lot of people stay there in stage 3 the rest of their lives, but I think more and more are finding out that there's something after doubt, and it's a new kind of faith. And maybe I would call that faith and doubt in creative tension.
I want to come back and talk about this fourth stage, which you call harmony. But toward the end of your book, you talk about your mother.
Yeah.
And what a sweet person she was, what a faithful Christian she was, and how she seemed to be all of her life pretty comfortable there in stage 1. It could have described my dad just to a T. Sweet, genuine, devout, none of the ugliness of what we would call fundamentalism, all of the sweetness that we want in the Christian religion, but still pretty black and white, pretty a pretty simple, basic approach to things. So I appreciated what you said about your mother, and I think we have to remember that, don't we? That even people we love
Yes,
are in a different stage of this journey.
that's right. That's right. You know, I don't think I told this story in the book, but my mother had, you know, she was not the kind of person to rock any boats.
Neither was my dad.
But when we moved from New York down to Maryland, and we attended a church where there was some pretty overt racism. I mean, I was a little kid, but she had never really encountered that among Christians before. And she became the closest she ever became to an activist, where she made sure that when we did some church-related activities, we teamed up with some Black churches of our denomination, and she just made sure she would invite people over to have dinner at our table of different races and all the rest. And I think it's because at the core of her simplicity, she got the message that the core of everything is love, and that's what she wanted to live.
That certainly could describe my dad as well. He never was an activist about anything except Kentucky basketball. But certainly had a warm and generous heart toward everybody, even though we lived as perhaps you did in a white community, in a white church, in a white Christianity, and we're insulated from almost all the stuff we're dealing with today about how to frame and understand what it means to follow Jesus. But like you, I've been through these stages. I do want to ask you, of course, there are many people in America. I've talked to many, you've talked to thousands, I'm sure, many of them one-on-one, who are struggling to go from stage to stage. I want you to talk a little bit more about doubt.
Yes.
Because each of these stages seems to be defined as it relates to doubt.
Yes.
Stage one, doubt is an enemy,
Yes,
so to
that's
speak.
right. Yeah. In fact, if I were to just summarize, stage one, doubt is an enemy to fight at all costs. Stage two, doubt is a problem to solve. Stage three, doubt is a liberation from oppression. And stage four, doubt is part of life, But one way to think of it is like this. You can see it really clearly with stage one, simplicity. When we're children, we have no choice but to trust our parents and the other authority figures. That's where we get our understanding of reality. I mean, most of us, some of us grow up in settings where that doesn't work. But when you reach a point where the authority figures are telling you things that you no longer think are true or good or healthy, that's when you not only have doubts, but then you wonder, should I keep abiding by this set of rules that the authority figures tell me what to think? And so you're not just doubting specific things, you're doubting the rules of the game up until that point. And that's what pushes you into the next stage. And in complexity, you want to figure things out for yourself. So you go to college and you read books and you take courses and you listen to a variety of voices. So you learn to think for yourself. And so that set of rules works until you realize, hold it, all the books I'm reading are by people who have the same point of view. Maybe I need to actually listen to some people who have a very different point of view. And that at that point, you're ready for perplexity. And so
there are a lot of people who've traveled this road. And I'm glad you said earlier that there are many people who have different descriptions, different paradigms of this journey, but not everybody is traveling this journey.
Right.
Some people are going in the opposite direction on this road.
Yeah.
Some people were born into secularism and nihilism, and they're searching for faith and end up in some of the most conservative of churches.
Yes.
How do we weave their stories into this paradigm?
Well, I think there'd be two different ways I could see this happening in this paradigm. One would be you could be brought up in what I would call a stage one atheist family, where
Right.
all of the authority figures tell you there's no God, religion's a hoax, don't believe a bit of it. And you could imagine a person having doubts about that and doing what I would call a lateral conversion, where they go from being a stage one atheist to being a stage one Christian or Muslim or whatever. But I think there's another phenomenon that is very common, and I think we're seeing a lot in our country right now. And that's where a person's in late stage 2 or stage 3, and it looks so scary to them that they just say, I can't handle this amount of
Ambiguity.
ambiguity and uncertainty. Yeah. And so they, in a sense, take a regressive path and say, I want to find somebody who will do my thinking for me. I want to find a group where I will just believe whatever they tell me. I personally think that is the making of a cult. But I also think it describes what's happening to a lot of people today.
Well, these 4 stages, you came very close to using these stages or adapting them even to political culture, where people could go through these things, not related to religion, but to politics or even experiencing the world. I think about the way our country is grappling with the single storyline that we've been told about our history versus now the complexity of stories that have comprised our national history. And some people, rather than exploring these stories and embracing it, are retreating back into the one story.
Yes.
It's as if they cannot handle the complexity of who we are as a nation, as a people.
Yeah. Yeah. I had an experience once that gives me empathy for people in that situation. It was a long time ago when I was a pastor, and there was a lot of conflict going on in the church. And this is before cell phones, when we had answering machines. You'll remember those. And I was getting so many hate mail or, hate messages or angry messages, and so much conflict. And I'd never been this kind of person before, but I remember I would go a few days without checking my voicemail messages. Mm-hmm. and the reason I did is I was under so much stress. I couldn't, and maybe the message would have been benign or even encouraging, but I didn't have the emotional reserves to check my messages. And I think there are some people who are at that level of anxiety. And can I say, I think we should be worried about that, because what I now realize is there are politicians and religious leaders who build a loyal following by making other people afraid. And so they pump fear into the system. And when people are afraid enough, it makes them more vulnerable to just believing somebody's comforting lies.
There's no question that there is an enormous amount of fear in American political life right now. Yeah. The rhetoric, as a matter of fact, what has happened, you and I are about the same age. We remember when the culture wars started.
Yeah.
And religious leaders began to use this, the vocabulary of the battlefield.
Yes.
To describe our role in America. And of course, that turns citizens into enemies.
Yes.
And radicalizes people's judgment about what's going on. And we're seeing the fruit 40 years later.
Yes.
Of this kind of the use of language that's built on fear. Be afraid of your neighbor. Be afraid of your pastor. Be afraid of your governor.
Yes.
It is disturbing.
Yes.
And the religion, there's a lot of that in American religion right now. There's no question about that. Yeah. So against this kind of fear, you project this stage 4. I'll have to pause here and say, normally when we're talking about stage 4, it's a bad thing. Somebody had stage 4 cancer and you think, oh my, that's a bad place to be. And now you're talking about stage 4 as being the great place to be. let's talk about this stage 4 harmony.
Yeah.
I've got lots of questions about it. Describe it for us, what you see as stage 4 spirituality, stage 4 religion.
Well, I think the best way for me to do that is to start with stage 3. You know,
Okay.
in my mind, the heaven for stage 3 people is graduate school, because if you get a graduate degree, you study original sources and you learn about all the arguments. You know, even when you're an undergraduate in college, all the textbooks make it sound like things are pretty much figured out. But you get to graduate school, you find out, oh my goodness, everything is contested.
Yes.
And but here's one of the problems: when you learn to be suspicious, and many times what happens is you become suspicious of everything, and so you're afraid to trust anything, and you're afraid to make a commitment to anything, because you think everything ends up disappointing you or being proven to be false or fraudulent or whatever in the long term. And so I think what happens to a lot of people in stage 3 is they say, look, I got to have a life. I want to marry somebody. I want to have children. What am I going to teach my children?
Yeah.
And suddenly you realize I can't just live with suspicion and skepticism. I actually need some amount of commitment to move forward. And so I think that becomes one of the things that drives people. Another thing that happens to people in stage 3 is they say they've been so suspicious about everybody else. And then they say, maybe my suspicion now is just my game. Maybe, and they become in a sense suspicious of their own suspicion and cynical about their own cynicism. And when that happens, they realize I can't stay where I am anymore. And so in a sense, they drive themselves out of stage 3. And I think moving into stage 4 involves, for some people, a kind of spiritual dimension to it, that it is, for many people, they have some experience that allows them to feel their connectedness with everybody. In other words, instead of just criticizing, here's how these people are wrong, and these people are wrong, and these people are oppressive, and these people are unjust, realize, but you know what? I'm unjust and I'm oppressive sometimes. We're all human beings. And when a kind of wave of compassion and solidarity replaces that critique and suspicion, I think that helps us move into stage 4. One other thing that I think happens is we look back on our own lives and we say, you know, I was in that simplicity stage, and instead of just being mad at other people who are there, why don't I realize that that's where I started too? How could I help those people instead of just resenting them? And when that compassion happens, I think that moves you to a different place.
Well, of course, your use of graduate school is really apropos. I even remember the phrase, the hermeneutic of suspicion.
Yes.
Which runs across disciplines. But your description here may help explain how people who go through college and graduate school and then even into doctoral work, at some point, they seem to give up on all this and revert back to stage 1.
Yeah.
And they forget a lot about what they have learned and what they've grappled with and the doubts that they have, and you know, go back to stage 1 and and just reaffirm all these black and white and true and false and in and out ways of looking at things.
You know, I think that parenthood helps me understand this a good bit, because when you think that in stage 1, when you're a child, your job is to learn the rules. And then you think, I think a lot of people, when they become parents, they revert back because now for the next 18 plus years, they're giving the rules.
That's right.
And so I think that explains it. I think very often the most conservative people are the people who are raising small children, because, and especially when the children are small, because parents think they can control their children. But of course, once the children get to be teenagers, they usually find out that it doesn't work so well. And very often it's when their children either grow up and reject everything they've ever taught them, or their children push back in such a way that parents pick up their own growth process,
The children have not been taught how to deal with doubt all along, how to deal with their questions and their challenges to all the authorities and around them. And when that happens, they can't deal with it in a healthy way, and they.
One of the things I hope is that this book will be outdated in 40 or 50 years. And here's the reason I say that. When most of our parents are in stage 1 or stage 2, they can't help us grow beyond where they are. Nobody can help someone get beyond where they are. But if we had more and more parents who are parenting from a stage 4 perspective, they would help their children grow through these stages in a different way. And if we had more pastors who are and priests who are teaching and leading from that stage 4 perspective, they would help people through the stages without being afraid. But unfortunately, in so much of American religious life, the religious leaders are working from a stage 1 or stage 2 place, and they just can't help people beyond them.
And a lot of times they have to work from there because they are hemmed in by their congregations or by their bishops or by their authorities.
Yes.
And they cannot say what they really think or follow their passions or their instincts in this way. So this harmony, before we get to the subject of these communities of harmony, which was a part of the book that I found fascinating, let's talk about how doubt is a gateway into harmony.
Yeah.
And can lead us to what you call stage 4.
Yeah. So I think in many ways, stage 3 perplexity is the stage where everything is in doubt. And so doubt really predominates. You could say faith is dominant in stage 1, but now doubt is dominant in stage 3.
Right.
And I think when you have, in a sense, had doubt purged through your entire belief system, and in a sense, you're stripped naked, and it feels like there's nothing left. It's interesting. The phrase that comes to mind is a phrase that's used in a very different sense, but it has an opportunity of being born again. Meaning,
yes. Well, this phrase came to my mind as I read your book.
Yes.
That faith is the birthing. It's the birthing of a new part of life, a new person often.
Yes. And so I know, because those of us who grew up in church, we tend to think of someone like the Apostle Paul as somebody who knew a lot. But I think it's also important to see Paul as somebody who doubted a lot. Paul had to come to a place where he doubted everything he had been taught.
Yeah,
and he doubted everything he taught, virtually everything he taught. I mean, the verse that just really became, so radiant for me in the writing of this book was a verse in Galatians where Paul says, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision means anything at all, which, circumcision sounds like such an arcane and odd subject. But if we think of it this way, it was a boundary marker. Here's how you show that you're inside our religion, and here's how you see if a person's outside our religion. Paul's saying the boundary markers are meaningless. And then he says the only thing that matters is faith expressing itself in love. And so suddenly you realize Paul was a doubter, but when he doubted everything, the one thing that really remained for him was love. He does the same thing in 1 Corinthians 13. And he says the only thing that lasts are faith, hope, and love. And of those three, love is the greatest.
In that text, he is also famous for the phrase, we see through a glass darkly.
Yes.
Everything is indeterminate or uncertain or except, as you say, faith, hope, and love. And if you had to pick one of these, I'm going with love, which is the way you emphasize this in your book.
I had an interesting experience. Oh, it was over 10 years ago now, I think. I got to hear the famous French philosopher Jacques Derrida speak at a conference. And I tried to read some of his books, and I found them very hard to read. And when I got to hear him lecture, I got it, and I could go back and read his books. And what I discovered is Jacques Derrida was really, really funny. And when I went back and read his books as if he were being lighthearted, I saw everything differently. But Derrida, it's interesting. He's famous for the word deconstruction.
Right.
And the idea of deconstruction is that we look behind any concept and there's a story behind it. And when we really bear down on the story, in a funny way, we see the problems with even the things that seem precious to us. And late in his life, and this is shortly after September 11, 2001, Derrida said, only justice is undeconstructible. And of course, I think Cornel West says that justice is what love looks like when it goes out in public.
Yeah, that's a great statement.
The sense that love and justice, that there are undeconstructible things, and maybe they'll vary from person to person. But in my experience, when people go through that deep, deep, deep doubt, they end up like Paul and like Jesus, because Jesus, said very similar things. And they say, look, the only thing that really matters is love. Love is what counts. Without love, you're nothing, Paul said. Or the great commandment, everything is summed up in love. So that seems to me to be the portal that happens in stage 3. Now, in stage 4, I should say, if you live there long enough, you can't become complacent. Because what you find out is, even though now things are clear, I really put love first. Now I find out that love is complicated. And times when I thought I was being loving, I was actually hurting someone. And so I think in that way, then you enter a new stage of complexity and maybe a new stage of perplexity. And my guess is these stages become iterative or cyclical.
Yes, it's certainly true that justice, the public form of love, as you said a minute ago, is a complicated thing.
Yeah.
Because justice for one person or one group can look very much like injustice for another group. Yeah. And it is a contested landscape in American life and all over the world. What does justice look like? It's not as simple.
Yes.
And as we think it is, as advocates and marchers think it is. So you talk about communities of harmony. Are you in a community of harmony?
If you're talking about a local church,
I want to know what you're talking about.
Yeah. So let me say, I wish that there were more churches around that were communities of harmony. I don't think we have nearly enough. And I think that I attend a little Episcopal church here where I live in Florida. And I think it's a church that is beginning to struggle with what it really wants to be. Like a lot of churches in America, I think our church in some ways has survived by ambiguity. Let's not make it really clear what we stand for, because if we do, we'll offend some people. And I'm not blaming anybody for that. I don't think that's the problem of this or that priest. I think this is the deal by which American churches have survived. And underneath it is something we talked about today, which is, let's not talk about race because that will polarize. So let's just be ambiguous about everything so we don't get into fights. I think that's not a community of harmony. I think that's a community of denial. But I think my little congregation here that I'm part of is beginning to grapple with this. But I'm glad to say what I think happens to a lot of people when they can't find an existing community of harmony is that they form one and they build a network of friends. Look, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I would bet that part of the Meetinghouse is creating space where people can hear certain kinds of conversations that aren't available to them. And that's why I see it happening in many ways.
I'm just sitting here thinking as you talk, and even as I read the book, that the community of harmony the prominent community of harmony in my life is a virtual community.
Yeah.
I hadn't connected it with the Meetinghouse, but I think you're right. This is my ambition for the Meetinghouse, that it might be a community of harmony. My guest last week was one of the most conservative Southern Baptist preachers in Atlanta, Georgia. We happened to have been in school together. We had a very warm and cordial conversation, but and he is troubled by what's going on in the Southern Baptist Convention and all the issues, all the ambiguities floating around there. So, gosh, I'm hopeful that the Meetinghouse can be this place. I did get a long email from a longtime friend of mine who read my column this week and wrote me last night about how he had left a congregation but had found a community of harmony. He didn't call it that. But it was in the neighborhood where he lives.
Yeah.
And talked about the care they had for one another, the joy that the friendships and the community cultivated. It was as if he was describing a community of harmony that didn't have any of the toxicity that we associate, not just with churches, but with political parties and other organizations all over.
And it's a precious thing when one exists, and it has to be cultivated, and it's and in some ways the safety of one of those communities is easily lost. So it's really a precious thing, and I don't think it happens automatically. I think it takes some people with some maturity and with some willingness to suffer to help those communities come into existence.
It makes me wonder if we could describe Jesus and his entourage of disciples and the women and the curious and the Zacchaeuses that gathered around the circumference of Jesus. If that had not the making of what you call a community of harmony, built out of the spiritual life of Jesus himself. So,
I think so, and I think we forget. But you imagine Jesus going from town to town, and there's a beggar who everybody looks at as trash and an annoyance, and when Jesus comes to town, the beggar has value.
Yeah.
One of the stories I've actually just been thinking about lately, there are a couple versions of it, but it's a story of Jesus encountering either one or two demoniacs. And we always talk about the healing where Jesus heals this man and he's clothed and in his right mind. But as I read it this week, I thought, but you know what else? That village was trying to put him in chains.
Yeah.
And so the village had a sickness of its own. And so for them to be healed of their judgmental and harsh attitude toward one of their own, it is part of the miracle story there, I think.
Well, I feel quite certain that where you go to speak, that you bring with you some of this community of harmony. And as you write, people are drawn into it. And I bless you for this. I thank you for it. It's been great to talk to you today. It was wonderful to read your book. And if you ever come back to St. Simon's Island again, I want to know about it.
Fantastic, my friend. Great being with you again.
God bless you. I'm Dwight Moody in the Meetinghouse with Brian McLaren talking about his new book, Faith After Doubt. I'll be back in just a minute with my commentary for the week. Quitting church, a final word. Yes, we've read all the statistics about the decline of church life. The Gallup organization released their data. Scholar Ryan Burge, who was my guest in the Meeting House just 3 weeks ago, published his book called The Nones, Nones. And yes, everything else is on the decline as well. I wrote about that last week. Sports, television, clubs, movies, even having babies. And then I wrote my own story about leaving church. I entitled it, I'm Taking a Walk. That was last November. You can find that column at themeetinghouse.net. Many people have stories like mine, not necessarily about race, politics, and church, but more often about personalities, power, and privilege. Like the longtime friend who responded to my column with this testimony, quote, I've been in church since I was born. When I grew up and we moved from place to place, we always connected with and joined a new church. I have now not been to church in about a year and not sure I will ever go back. I'm still a believer and a follower of Christ. It's not Christ I've lost faith in, it's the church. I've witnessed so many behaviors from those associated with and ensconced in the church that are definitely not Christ-like. I do not want people to think I'm, quote, that kind of Christian, end quote. I've joined a weekly Bible study with friends. My husband and I have taken our weekly church offerings and used it to help others in our community. I'm not certain if I can go back. If lifetime Christians like myself are leaving, I cannot imagine folks wanting to join based on some of the behaviors seen with a large number of, quote, religious folks. This is what I have seen and heard and felt for years. Church, of course, is not the only place where people misbehave and violate the tenets of an organization, where personal prerogative and toxic personality becomes the norm, where survival strategies misplace missional commitments, where caring for the self replaces caring for the other, where the good news of Jesus is overshadowed by the bad news of, quote, people putting people down. That's a quote from John Prine. And then this week, I saw a prominent minister in California quoted as saying this. It was from a sermon preached many years ago, but still on his website, quote, a woman, whether she is married or single, must recognize the fact that in general, as a woman, she must have a spirit of submission to all men, end quote. Such foolishness helps explain the emotional seething that motivated another friend to confide in me this week. Quote, I don't think I can take it any longer. I've been a member of my church for 25 years and many of my friends are here. Where would I go? But it's just crazy what they think and say. They are ignoring reality. Their minds are closed, end quote. Brian McLaren, my guest today, writes about this in his new book, Faith Beyond Belief, Why Your Beliefs Stopped Working and What to Do About It. He points out that often it is not toxic congregational life that drives people from their pews, but rigid doctrinal positions and a firm grasp on what is perceived as right and what is assumed to be wrong. My review of that book is elsewhere in this newsletter and also on the website, themeetinghouse.net. McLaren proposes a new paradigm of Christian faith and practice. The latter portions of his book describe what he calls harmony and the kind of local communities that embody that way of being in the world. And I quote, a humble, reverent openness to mystery that expresses itself in non-discriminatory love, end quote. Others, like Rod Dreyer, prefer an older model, what he calls in a 2019 book, the Benedict option. Pull away from the world, establish our own communities, live to ourselves as much as possible, and keep the flame of truth, virtue, and righteousness alive in this dark and dangerous world. Monasteries emerged out of that strategy, and in more recent times, groups like Shakers and the Amish, as well as cults of all kinds. I'm not so dismissive of life in the modern world. Like any age, there's enough good to make up for what is bad. I find myself drawn to the very simplest and oldest of all strategies, to that original confession, Jesus is Lord, to the first and second commandments, to love God and love our neighbor, to that most universal of all documents, the Bible itself, telling us about God's story, and the prayer, what I call the prayer of Jesus, what we mostly call the Our Father, as a guide to how to live, how to think, how to pray. It's hard to go wrong with these sane and sturdy signposts along our troubled way. But what also helps is good friends, a grateful spirit, a healthy dose of laughter, and as often as possible, a walk in the woods or a stroll on the beach. These things are helping me in this season and helping me also prepare to preach this Sunday the good news of Jesus, risen Lord. And I'm grateful for all of it. I'm Dwight Moody in the Meetinghouse. I'll be back in just a minute. You're in the Meetinghouse with me, your host, Dr. Dwight A. Moody, coming to you from our North Carolina studio. You can visit the website at themeetinghouse.net. There you'll find all of these commentaries, book reviews, all of the podcasts. As a matter of fact, today's show will be up as a podcast by Saturday. You can just subscribe to the weekly newsletter. I need some new subscribers. Every week, people unsubscribe. I had one unsubscribe this week. I send it out at 8:30 every Wednesday night. It's free, and I always appreciate your feedback. Thank you for listening today. Coming to you over themeetinghouse.net and rejoice975.com, FM 97.5, 94.7 in Glenn County, Georgia, and SSC Live TV through the St. Stephen's Baptist Church of Louisville, Kentucky. I want to thank my engineer, Everett Armstrong, in the studio at the Golden Isles of Georgia, engineer Alex Mattingly in Louisville, Kentucky, and to Brian McLaren, my friend, my colleague, my fellow traveler, and my guest today in the Meetinghouse. Thank you for your interest. Write me. You can follow me on Twitter. I'm all the way up to 405. That's pretty measly in the Twitter world, you know. Until next week, I encourage you to be safe, to do justice, to love mercy, to wash your hands, get a vaccine. I had mine finished last week. Wear a mask when you have to. Drink some coffee, order some coffee from our friends out in California. Send a donation to the Meetinghouse. Join our Circle of 70. You can read all about that at themeetinghouse.net/support. Pray for the soul of America. We're all in this thing together. Be kind to everyone you meet. In the Meetinghouse, I'm Dwight A. Moody. Have a great day.